Welcome to Flash Me Back Hardware Tales and episode number 3 of my 386 PC build. Last time we fixed the mainboard's battery leakage and gave it a first test. This time we are making sure the case I picked is in the best possible condition. We already heard the power supply's fan is super noisy, let's see what other surprises we find. Enjoy! And that is the case. It's a few years newer than the mainboard and CPU, about 1994, but it's surprisingly hard to find AT PC cases these days. The first thing we see is that the turbo button is missing. I already knew that from the eBay item description and I have an idea what to do about it. Then there's a small crack on the front bezel, I hope I can fix that as well. Besides that, it's mostly dirt and a few smaller problems with the paint like this burst corner. Let's open it up and take a look inside. Here the situation is similar. Everything is mostly okay, but there's some rust going on in the corners. Besides that, the case is in pretty decent shape, except for some tape residue here and there. Another problem is that the PC speaker is missing, but that's easy to solve. I should have a bunch of them in stock somewhere. Okay, let me take it apart. I'll first remove the front bezel, and here I already noticed that the turbo switch is the only thing not hot glued into place. Maybe that has to do with the missing button. Also, the power switch has seen better days. I'll see what I can do about that. Finally, I removed the power supply. The first thing I want to address is the missing turbo button. Luckily, the reset button seems to be the exact same shape, so I can use that as a reference. I tried finding something appropriate for days, but I wasn't even able to find plastic in the correct color and thickness. An alternative was 3D printing it, which would have been possible by visiting the local hackerspace, but again I would have had to buy a whole spindle of beige filament, way too expensive. So what I'm trying to do instead is use thinner pieces of ABS and sandwich them into a block that is thick enough for the turbo button, about 4.8 mm. The source material I'm going to use is a 5¼ inch drive bay cover. The material is about 2 mm thick, so I'll need 3 layers. I removed the rim and then tried to fold it over using a heat gun. It worked okay-ish, and in the end I had something that looked like it could work. It was hard to fold over though, and the heat gun darkened the plastic in some places. My idea was to file it down to the correct size. I worked for quite a while, checking the proportions regularly, and while at first I thought it might work out, in the end the result was rather underwhelming. It's still pretty obvious where the folds were, and it looks terrible overall. My second idea was to try to fuse 3 sheets, which I took out of the same drive bay cover, wrap them in aluminum foil to preserve the shape, and then just bake them at around 200 degrees. In the end I got a solid block of the required thickness that I then cut into roughly the right size. Since I noticed that the file was way too rough for this job, I used sandpaper of different grids here, always checking the proportions and comparing the shape to the reset button. Once I reached more or less the correct shape, I went to finer grit sandpaper to smoothen it all. In the end, I was quite happy with the result. The two don't look exactly indistinguishable and the color doesn't quite match, but the result is good enough. All that's missing is the hole in the back to stick the nib of the actual pin in. I used my Dremel and a set of PCB drills for that. Using them like a router helped me get a good enough shape, which I then successfully tested with the turbo switch. Next I was going to fix the two cracked plastic pieces, the power button and the rim of the front bezel. The only indication of what kind of plastic they were made of is the recycling label on the bezel. This one indicates it should be high density polyethylene or HDPE. The problem is that most glues are unsuitable for HDPE, but at least they shouldn't dissolve it. Since the bond is not going to have to be very strong, I'll try typical cyanoacrylate superglue. I started with the power button because it won't matter as much when I fail there. I tried to carefully open the crack a bit more so that the glue could get in there, then I squeezed it closed with a pair of pliers. And the result looks good enough to me. So I repeated the same with the bezel, applying the glue from the inside after bending the cracked part out carefully so that I could get the glue in between. After a while I removed the blob of glue that had accumulated on the inside, because the metal cover of the case will snap into there and it might break more of the plastic if there were a bump. And the results look pretty decent to me, at least the crack shouldn't get any worse anymore. Now, of course, all those plastic fixes also require the case to be clean, and the most prominent part of the case is the front bezel. So I took it apart to remove all the buttons and LEDs. I accidentally broke off a wire from the turbo button, which is probably not a sign of quality, and I forgot to film me fixing it, so the next time you'll see it, it'll be magically attached again. The dark transparent inlay was just held in place by some hot glue on the backside, so it was easy to remove as well. And look at all the grime in there. Then a good, not too warm bath in soap water, as I do for all my refurbishing projects. I didn't want to submerge the inlet in water because I think it's mostly hollow and I don't want to get water trapped in there through the LED holes. So instead I wiped it with a paper towel and alcohol. The two original buttons deserved some cleaning too, also with alcohol. In the meantime, the bezel had soaked long enough so that I could clean it thoroughly with a toothbrush. With that all done, I could finally reassemble it by putting the inlay back in and then installing the buttons and LEDs. In the end, I fixed everything with hot glue again. I could also install the reset and the new turbo button. The power switch will have to wait until I reassemble the case as a whole. To clean the rest of the case, I first removed all remaining removable parts, the 3.5-inch internal drive bay and the frame for expansion cards. As I showed you earlier, there is some rust, interestingly only on the external drive bay frame. At first I wanted to remove it using a Dremel and a wire brush and then repaint it, but it turned out it was not that hard to get rid of the dust using nothing but vinegar and some rubbing. I decided against repainting it because really it looks good enough this way, and I guess if it starts rusting again I can still do it again. But I intend to keep the computer in good environmental conditions, so this will probably do. After that I got rid of the vinegar and dust and fingerprints in general using some alcohol and paper towels. I removed the rubber feet so I could better reach inside the pits that make them stand out more on the bottom. The feet then got a nice warm bath. The remains of these ancient plastic struts had to go too. They are so worn out they're completely useless. There was some nasty tape residue in some places, but with alcohol and some elbow grease I got rid of that as well. With everything clean, it was time to put it all back together. Getting the wire plugs from the front panel through the small opening was a bit fiddly, but after some tinkering I got it all through and screwed the panel back on. Of course, no DOS PC is complete without a PC speaker, so here comes a new one. I had originally planned to paint the one corner with the burst paint, but I figured it wouldn't match the color perfectly and in the end it would probably look worse than keeping it the way it is now. Instead I just gave it a good cleaning using some window cleaner and a microfiber cloth. Maybe I'll repaint it completely one day, but I think it would ruin the rough surface finish. It'll probably stay the way it is. The one thing left to do with the case now is to fix the power supply. We'll at least have to replace the fan, which made horrible noises as we noticed last episode. The first thing I realized was that the warranty seal was broken and the screws holding the PSU together had taken some heavy abuse by some former tinkerer. Clearly the power supply has been serviced before, not necessarily by someone who cared too much. But while we're at it, we should also give it a good clean. By the way, please do not see this as a tutorial on how to service power supplies. I am by no means professionally qualified to service devices operating at mains voltages, and you shouldn't believe a single word I say about this stuff. I will not be responsible for any damage or injuries you may cause or endure if you disregard this warning. That being said, let's go. Before I got to fix the fan, I realized a 12-volt power wire was loose. Can you believe it? Imagine this wire came into touch with a 230 volts line. Goodbye, valuable retro hardware. I think the fan has been replaced before, and not very professionally. The fan's wires were just twisted together and then insulated using Scotch tape. I began fixing the loose 12-volt wire. It supplies power to these two drive power plugs. It turned out the wire was not soldered into the board at all, so I fixed that problem and went on to the fan. My first attempt was to clean the fan and fix the wires properly. I removed the tape, which had gotten very brittle and made quite a mess. Then I soldered the wires together and insulated them back with shrink tubing. Then I spent some time cleaning the fan. I also wanted to open the fan spindle to clean and lube it, but on this fan it would have meant drilling into the plastic, and I don't think it would be worth the effort. After cleaning, the fan sounded much quieter, so I cleaned the rest of the power supply and reassembled it. I cleaned the case with alcohol. Interestingly, the plastic insulator sheet was the dirtiest. Then I reinstalled the fan and the PCB, plugged in all the connectors and had to fiddle a bit with the cable reliefs. I used a set of new screws, the old ones were just too nasty looking. But after powering on the PSU, the noise of the fan got loud again. I assume the fan's casing warped slightly when screwed into the PSU, so I opened the power supply again and replaced the fan completely. I had this modern fan laying around. In addition to ground and 12-volt power supply, it also has a tachometer pin. The power supply has no use for that, so I just desoldered it. The plug type is the same, just 3 pins instead of 2, so I could just remove the pins from the 2 plugs and snap the new ones in without any further soldering. The fan went back into the power supply and it is now at the regular noise level. So with that done too, we can finally integrate it back into the PC case. And you noticed it before, but derpy me didn't. Of course I had to remove the front panel again to screw the power switch into place. But that went fast and I can proudly announce the case to be finished now. Hooray! And that concludes this episode of the 386 build series. Next time we are finally going to start building the machine. Make sure you don't miss the next episode by subscribing. And if you liked the video, why don't you, well, like it? I hope you did like it, and until next time, bye!